Hey friends, Joe Four here with Afterburner. What do you think about when you hear the words virtual event? Another day of death by PowerPoint, long days with little value, staring endlessly into a video camera, or maybe just plain boredom. Now think about what you loved about an in-person event. A chance to connect with peers and strengthen relationships. Maybe it was a great session or a shared experience with colleagues that left you inspired, energized, and aligned to your organization's purpose. For more than 25 years, Afterburner has been a forerunner in training in the seminar industry, creating unique experiences for our clients through inspirational keynotes, experiential team building, and customized workshops around the globe. Nothing will ever replace that human-to-human interaction and energy that you get from an in-person event. But if you can't get your teams together this year, can you really afford to wait until 2022 to invest in their growth? Meetings, conferences, and training events are critical to align teams, develop leaders, build teamwork, and just the overall ability to improve morale. But until now, virtual events have not been a comparable solution. Afterburner is here to change that. Our virtual and hybrid experiences focus on content, experiential and interactive content that engages participants through storytelling, videos, polls, chat boxes, breakout rooms, and more. No more death by PowerPoint. We focus on connection, gamified, simulated experiences that help your team strengthen relationships and build teamwork. And finally, we focus on collaborative learning. No more long days of speaker after speaker going through slide after slide. Afterburner programs focus on smaller group breakout sessions where your team can collaborate around real-world objectives and focus on learning that actually sticks. Don't let your team pay the price in morale and momentum waiting until the next time you can bring them together in person. Connect with us today so together we can create a one-of-a-kind shared experience for your team that unleashes their true potential.
Great. Thank you so much, Ansley, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are out there. Please remember, just like Ansley said, please stick around until the end of the Q&A portion. Submit your questions there on the right side of the chat window there or in the Q&A block. I'd love to get to those questions at the end. We're going to answer whatever questions do pop up. And so, again, make sure you're writing those up. That'd be great. So today we're really going to talk about teams and, more importantly, how to build high-functioning and very effective teams. First off, let me introduce myself. As Ansley said, my name is Chris Gomez. I am a former United States Navy SEAL, and not only was I a SEAL, I did have the distinct honor of being chosen to be a SEAL instructor. So that meant by trade I was a corpsman, which is a medic, and that meant I went through 18 Delta, or Joint Special Operations Forces Trauma Course. During my time in the teams, I completed a couple of deployments, and I was able to qualify in many, well, I always say these SEAL-type things. I always shortcut this by saying basically I was paid to jump out of planes, shoot guns, blow things up, and scuba dive, which in my estimation was every teenage boy's dream come true. But after about 12 years, I like to think I grew up a little, and due to some new opportunities, I became a naval officer. And it was then that I had the chance to learn about contract management and even to become a business financial manager. In my final tour in the Navy, just prior to wrapping up 21 years of service where I retired, I was given the opportunity to attend the University of Texas, and I earned my MBA. It was really a life-changing event, and it's a primary reason that I'm here today talking with you representing Afterburner. So during my time at Afterburner, where I am an associate partner, I have had the pleasure of working with tons of different teams, mainly in software and CPG, beverage and snack companies, oil and gas, all over the map. And all of these teams had the expressed desire to help them get the absolute most out of their teams and their team building experience. So since you're here today on a webinar, you've likely engaged with Afterburner in the past in some capacity, and you know that we are a team of former elite and military professionals who have been teaching great business organizations the same tools and the techniques that we then learned in our military career. Now, I know I've given you a bit of my background, and you may be asking yourself, why am I sitting here on a Thursday afternoon listening to a former SEAL talk about teams? Well, as a former SEAL and instructor, I certainly think I'm uniquely positioned to understand both how teams effectively operate, as well as how you can cure some of the typical team-type dysfunctions that you may encounter in your world. At SEALs, we care so much about the idea of teams, and the importance of that is that we don't refer to each other as SEALs. Sometimes we may refer to each other as frogmen or frogs, but 95% of the time when another SEAL is talking about another SEAL, we refer to each other as team guys. It is that ubiquitous. That means we are team guys first. That is our primary role and function. It's something that we are exceedingly proud about. So in this webinar, I'm going to share with you some of the stories from my experience as a SEAL, mainly training other Navy SEALs, and some of the stories that might be related to that with some of the teams that I've worked with out there in the private sector or in the corporate world. Really what we're going to do is I want to answer the question, or at least help you figure out how you can take the already effective team that you're operating with to that next level. We're going to talk some of the strategies and techniques that are going to give you the most value from your team experience. I'm going to share with you these strategies as both a leader and as a team member, and how you can effectively do both of these things. And lastly, we're going to look at enhancing our communication and collaboration among teams, because we find that collaboration is very common. It's very common throughout the private sector. However, effective collaboration isn't always, and that we're going to share with you some of these strategies and techniques that's going to help you enhance your communication and trust, most importantly, by aligning your team around a common picture of success, that long-term vision. So in a perfect world, we get to assemble our team, very carefully selecting each person based on certain skill sets, maybe a temperament, or even the cultural fit. Best case scenario, you are already out there teaching these skills and training your teams to be as effective from the get-go. But in reality, you're not likely starting a team from scratch. You're likely working with these teams that you're already working with these teams, or those are teams that you've essentially inherited, and you have to learn how to work with these folks on the fly. You know, what's funny is that even in the SEAL teams, we don't get to go out there and really pick and select each one of our platoon mates or our squadron mates. They are often selected for us for reasons way outside of our control, and we have to work hard to ensure that we are as effective as possible. We have to meld together as a team on the fly each and every time that we get pulled together. So no matter where you are in your team building process, you can begin to instill these lessons absolutely today. These are going to be some of the takeaways that are going to help your team get to that next level of success. This isn't just for the overall team or the overall team leader, you as the leader. It's really incumbent on each of us, each of our team members, to be as effective as possible and to utilize some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today. So today, by the time we wrap up and you're going to go back to your day, these are the things I really want you to walk away with, or at least be thinking about. I really hope that you're going to take away some of these tools, and that way you can start implementing these immediately. First off, how can you create a culture that is not afraid of failure? How can you foster within your teams that failure is okay? This isn't to say that you can continue to make the same mistakes. That's not it at all. But you have to be able to foster an environment where people don't hide their mistakes. The failure itself is not the issue. This is, of course, provided that you can all learn from that individual failure. I love the quote from Thomas Edison. He said that, I haven't failed. I have found 10,000 ways that don't work. How can you implement that level of thinking within your teams? So these failures and your team's understanding that they're okay, which is really the building block of trust. And that's what's one of the most key elements in understanding great teams. Trust is a key element and you gain trust by admitting your mistakes. After these inevitable mistakes pop up and they come to light, how can we leverage those learnings to not only raise the situational awareness of everyone in the room or on the team, but really raise that experience level for all of those who are out there working together. So let's first start. I'm going to level set on a few terms that I'm going to be using, and this is just the way that I think about these terms. And hopefully at the end of the day, you're going to understand at least that point of view. The first point of order is to define team. Now, this is my definition as I feel, because I think that the word team is vastly overused in business. So the word team is defined as a number of persons associated together to work in an activity or a type of work. And on its face, that sounds great. However, it's been my experience that the term doesn't always simply mean just that. Management loves to say, my team, when they're describing a group of either subordinates or coworkers without giving much thought to what that actually entails. And so let me ask the question, who here knows what the optimal size of a working team is? And I can tell you it's not that vice president who thinks I'm working with a team of 243 people. So studies have shown that the optimal working group or the working team size is 7 plus or minus 2. Now, why is that important? So if you often start with too many people in the room, which is typically the case, people are constantly fighting for airtime. They're wanting to be heard, and typically they're just going to sit and advocate for their position or their point of view. If you have too few people in the room, you say less than 5, people begin to get very capacity constrained. Oftentimes, they're unable to contribute or add value to the task due to the subject perhaps even being outside of their comfort zone. So having the optimal team, again, depending on what you're doing, is vitally important. So one of the big dysfunctions that we see in my many interactions with teams, we call this artificial harmony. So what is artificial harmony? Artificial harmony is typically described as just making nice, although underneath there are some real issues or some real concerns. The ego, our own individual egos, want to maintain this false sense of peace so that we can keep our thoughts and feelings, and in doing so, we keep our thoughts and feelings to ourselves. People have a tendency to avoid conflict, regardless of that conflict perhaps even being very necessary to advance. We use the phrase, we prefer respectful truth to artificial harmony. That's something that we came up with at Afterburner, and I think it's absolutely true. I can imagine that many of you feel the same way. You have to be able to share very respectfully a level of truth to help mitigate that artificial harmony. And the last term of art I want to discuss with you is that of failure. So typically it has a very negative tone or a very negative connotation, and that is certainly not the way I think of it. I think of failure as being absolutely imperative, that we're creating a team that's not afraid of failure. It is just simply one step in the process of learning, and we continue to move forward with it. And so let's apply some of those terms as we use them, and this is kind of the way I think about it. So because of the amount of adversity that we face, this is going back to SEAL training, because of the amount of adversity that we face, we cannot be afraid of failure. In order to grow, you have to be able to put yourself out there. You have to understand that there will absolutely be mistakes. I don't expect perfection. In all my years as a SEAL, I never had a perfect mission. In BUDS or basic underwater demolition SEAL training, you will quickly learn that you will fail at something. Now, whether it's a timed evolution or the ocean catches you napping when you're paddling through the surf zone, or like these gents going into the rocks face first, you will fail. So as an instructor, I had numerous professional and NCAA college athletes who got washed out of training due to their inability to overcome these failures. They were expecting to be perfect. They had never faced that level of adversity in their lives. So when students are outside of their comfort zone, we wanted to know, we as instructors wanted to know how they responded. We're looking for them to adapt, react, and to overcome those individual failures. We expect failure in SEAL training, but it's what you do next that really matters. Do you give up and quit? Do you continue to make the same mistakes over and over again, or do you learn from those mistakes, pivot, and get better next time? And it's that failure and that expectation of failure that ultimately leads to humility. And I find that how you as a leader handles failure is an absolute key component in that. Your team has to know that they don't have all the answers. You yourself as a leader don't have all the answers. An element of humility must exist on your teams or in your environment that leads itself toward trusting one another. The only thing stopping us with understanding that humility is oftentimes our ego. And when our ego gets in the way, that's where a lot of the team building and the trust really stops. So that I always say that humility leads to trust. Your team must trust you as a leader. They have to feel psychologically safe to not only make the mistakes and iterate from them, but ultimately to admit those mistakes so that they're not hiding these things that could be catastrophic to the overarching team. Trust is the absolute key here. And so what I want to do is let's think about trust a little differently. Obviously, we know that as SEALs, we have to trust one another, but it certainly isn't just SEALs that have to think about it this way. I was listening to a TED Talk the other day, and it featured this British conductor. His name was Charles Hazelwood. He spoke of the idea of trust in a very different environment, but it was really very relatable to me, and I'm not even a musically inclined individual. But he was talking about the immense amount of trust needed to pull an entire 100-person plus orchestra together and hit one note out of absolute thin air. So he was talking about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And for those of you who may not know that music, it's that very famous one. It has that very famous note. It starts out. And it's out of thin air. There's no precursor to that note. There's no lead up. It's just a downbeat of the conductor's baton, and a split second later, music happens. 100 people working together and hitting that note into perfection. How did they get there? It certainly wasn't through artificial harmony. You can't pretend that everybody's doing a great job when that, in fact, is not the case. They had to iterate and move through tons of practice sessions in order to get there. And I'm sure Mr. Hazelwood had to call out individuals that weren't playing properly. They had to come over that type of thing. It was very interesting. So Charles said in this interview that he was doing, he said that trust is born out of mutual respect. And while I wholeheartedly agree, that trust often originates in shared experiences through adversity and failure. And so how do you generate that with the team? How do you come up with the idea that failure is okay, we can iterate, we all work in adverse situations, and so we have to be able to iterate and get better. So let me share with you then another story of a time where I was working with a corporate team, and we were assisting these folks in getting through this very important initiative. And while we were about halfway through execution, and the leader of this team, we always call them in our phraseology, we call the leader an ace. They decided that the objective that we planned about a month ago was all of a sudden unachievable. And rather than hitting their goal of 100 deployments, they changed that number altogether. They changed that number from 80 to 60. And then a couple of weeks later, obviously they weren't working very hard, or they weren't hitting their objectives, so they changed that number again. The ace knocked it down. Instead of hitting 80 or even 60, they said, you know what, we're going to try to hit 40. And so nothing had really transpired to cause this momentous shift. There were not any unforeseen pop-up threats that meant that their goal was unachievable. They were just not executing. And the way I interpret this is they weren't executing to their best of their ability. Team members were not showing up to what we call these execution gap meetings, or X gaps. People were late with deliverables. Other things took time away from them. Maybe the priorities had shifted. And this isn't to say that all team members weren't working hard or doing a good job. Many of them were trying and even doing their part and even dropping in their deliverables. However, we did have a few that were holding up the show. And so those few that were holding up the show, the ace, or the leader again, he never addressed these issues. People were allowed to continue their lackluster efforts, and when the mission was wrapped up, and what was so odd is that the mission wrapped up and the ace stood in front of his room and said that they were triumphant. They met their goal of 40 deployments. Obviously, it wasn't the original goal of 80, not at all. The goalpost had been shifted. And because of this, they essentially, the goalpost had been moved 50% closer. They said instead of having a 100-yard touchdown, now if you get to the 50, great. We're super excited, and now you're there. Team members that had tried to hit that original goal or that objective were left to really wonder, why was this mission even undertaken in the first place? Was this even that important? What's the reason for this? Because we certainly didn't meet the goal that we all planned together and we all said was important, and that was 80. This was the personification of artificial harmony. Rather than address those issues in real time, correct them so people could learn and move on, they allowed themselves, or he, the leader, allowed this team to be really unproductive and allowed this behavior to fester and cause the mission to ultimately, in my case, not be successful. And rather than call out individual team members very respectfully and let them know where they fell short of their goals, they were basically said, hey, mission accomplished. They hung the banner. The leader thought he was doing the team a service by not addressing the fact that they had failed. They had hit 40, great. That was halfway to their objective. Again, it's not to say that that failure was the worst thing that could have happened to the team. What was essentially reinforced through this artificial harmony is the belief that each individual team member cannot fail on their own. And so that's what the leader was communicating to his team. When you start moving those goalposts, you end up really demoralizing the team. So what do you think the effect on the overarching team was? Well, as you can imagine, trust within the team was completely destroyed at that point. You know, the ACE didn't allow for the team to recognize the failure, address the issues that they were having, and address those root causes. Instead, people were essentially clinking champagne glasses at the end because their mission was 50% complete, or as the leader said, that they were successful. And so team members that were out there working and trying to hit that goal of 80 were certainly disillusioned, not only with their boss, but the rest of their teammates, and predictably, they were not able to make any significant progress on the follow-on missions. And in the years to come, many of those team members have either left the company or certainly moved on to other teams. You have to be able to reinforce personal responsibility. You have to train your team to accept responsibility for failure, to address it respectfully, of course, and then to correct it, learn from it, and get better. You know, we're not out here doing trust falls. We are about creating an environment where people can be their best selves and work together collectively to accomplish the goals of the team. This is what we said we were going to do. This is where we ended up. Moving the goalposts, in my mind, regardless of the progress, shows a lack of trust in the team, and essentially that falls on the leader's shoulders. So we've been talking a lot about failure, and let me tell you why. This is why it's so important. Your teams are already out there failing, whether you like it or not. We know that this is occurring in corporate America. This report was from the Market Associates, and it was published subsequently in HBR and through The Economist, and it showed that corporations are only achieving 33% of their strategic annual initiatives. That is an abysmal number. It seems terrible that 67% of the time we're not hitting our long-term objectives, our annual goals. And what that shows to me is a gap of execution. Again, it's a gap of teams not being able to work together, not being able to admit failure, learn, and move on. Instead, they're hunkered down, hiding even some of their mistakes. 33% of their results. Now, let's say that your teams are out there even executing. Let's say you're better than this and you're executing up to 50% of your objectives. There is still a lot of meat on the bone. There's still a lot of ways for your teams to improve their overall performance. So because you have a team that's afraid to admit that they failed, they're not going to benefit from anybody else's shared experiences. We always say that experience is a commodity that can very easily be shared amongst the team. You don't have to have a bunch of super experienced individuals, but when you have a team of individuals that have gained the experience and have learned lessons and have shared those lessons with other individuals, that is the way to ramp up the rest of the team's experience level. And we do that through those debriefs or through admitting our mistakes in front of one another. You know, each of us will go through this, oftentimes we'll go through this mental cost-benefit analysis when presented with an opportunity to share perhaps a lesson learned that we may have learned the hard way, or even some way that we can improve our own performance. And so we want to make sure that you as leaders are creating an environment where that cost-benefit analysis is very easily seen as a positive. Don't allow artificial harmony to take over by not sharing lessons learned from past failures. And that is really key. You want to make sure that your team, again, goes through that psychological safety where they understand that this particular failure or this particular issue isn't going to be met by the leadership as a huge issue, but really it's just a big learning opportunity. And because of these failures, because we're sharing with the collective team, we then can be a huge value add. Because we're having those individuals share some of the mistakes that they made and they can pivot and get better, this is what leads to that debrief And this is something that we can certainly have another webinar. I know that we've done many debriefing type webinars, and that perhaps is a topic for another day. So thinking about what we just walked through, some of what we talked through, you cannot be afraid to fail. Don't fall victim to artificial harmony. Don't allow your teams to sit back and think that everything's going well because the open, honest, humble feedback isn't being accepted. You have to make sure that you're all moving toward a goal. Don't be artificially harmonious in that case. We find that failure leads to humility, and then that humility leads to the development of trust. When you can be humble with your teams, and we say this all the time in our training, is that the debrief and setting a tone is a very leader-led endeavor. So it's being humble to your team, admitting your mistakes in front of your team as a leader. Make sure they have that environment where they can also admit their mistakes, because that's how you get better. And lastly, we have to make sure that we're utilizing some sort of debrief or some sort of ability to capture and share lessons learned from our others. We don't have to have names attributed to these individual lessons that we may have learned, but what we're looking for is that shared experience from individuals who have gone out, perhaps tried really hard, maybe failed at something, learned some great lessons so that the next time they're going to get that much better. And I certainly think that the great Nelson Mandela captured the idea, the absolute best about failure, when he said, "I never lose, I either win or learn." And that is the type of attitude that leaders should have when they're thinking about their individual teams too. Your teams don't lose, they either win or they learn. And that type of attitude is incumbent on the leadership. That is about being a good team player. That is about being someone on your team that's willing to make mistakes, admit what they don't know, ask for help, and learn from the process so they can share it out as much as possible.